Can you learn the game of chess in 15 minutes? Yes, you can, if you believe in yourself and you watch this video 10 times. The game of chess has 6 different kinds of pieces. It's played on 64 squares. We're going to go one at a time. We can't make you Picasso until we make you a finger painter. Let's clear the board. This first piece is the rook. The rook can travel up. He can go down, left and right. Very simple. The rook moves in any straight line. The rook captures by simply running into a piece. So if we put this enemy pawn on g5, notice we say the letter and then the number, the rook can simply slide over, land on top of the pawn, take it off the board. Can the rook capture this enemy pawn? Of course not, but in 2 moves it can. The rook can travel up to g7, and then on the next turn, if the pawn is silly and just sitting there, what are you doing, pawn? The rook can capture. You could, of course, also go to the left and on the next turn, travel up to capture the pawn. Let's learn the next piece. This one is called the bishop. The bishop moves along the diagonals of the board, much like the rook. It could travel just 1 square if it feels like it, or it could go to some sort of in-between amount, or all the way to the edge of the chessboard. If we draw arrows to every single square the bishop can move to along the diagonals, you're going to count, if you do it carefully, 13 squares. I hope you're not afraid of that number. The bishop has all of those options. Notice, if the bishop is on a dark square, it must stay on the dark squares for the rest of the game. The blue square, e5, if it travels, it's on a blue square, another blue square. If the bishop wants to capture something, it simply runs into it, a lot like the rook. So if the bishop wants to capture this pawn, the bishop runs into it and takes it off the board. One funny thing, if this pawn was on a light square, the bishop could never capture it. It has the cloak of invisibility. The bishop could travel here, and then here, and then here, and all the while the pawn is teasing the bishop. Let's move on and learn the next piece. The queen. She's quite simple but powerful. If you could somehow melt a rook and a bishop together, well, your alchemy would produce a queen. The queen has the power of the rook and the bishop combined. So that means she can go up and down like a rook, left and right like a rook, and of course diagonal like a bishop, and she makes a very pretty snowflake on the chessboard if you happen to be a 5-year-old and thinking in terms of those shapes. The queen can travel to every one of those squares. There's actually 27 of them, and much like the rook or the bishop, she simply captures by running into a piece. Now, if I have a pawn over here on this square, the queen would have many ways to get there in 2 moves. She could go sideways and then down. She could go diagonal and then up. She could even go a little crazy and go diagonal the opposite way and then sideways to capture. I have not named all of them. If you want to try to find a few more on your own, well, go for it. But I'm going to move on and teach you the 4th piece. This old guy here, that's the king. He's kind of like your grandpa. He can still get around, but he doesn't travel very quickly. The king moves 1 square any direction. That means up or down or left or right, or diagonal, but again, only 1 square. He's got a little bit of a force field around him, but that is it. Now, the king has a special importance, which we will get to later, but just to show you how slow the king is, if we put the king down here on the 1st rank, that's what we call our side-to-side rows, and we put a queen right beside the king, and we have a race to the other side of the board, well, it's not going to turn out like the tortoise and the hare. The king would travel 1 square, and then if it was the queen's turn, the queen could get there all in 1 turn. You can see it's going to take the king 7 different turns to get all the way to the other side. He's actually not a very powerful piece. We have 2 pieces remaining. The little guy, we've already named him. He's called the pawn, and you get more pawns than any other chess piece. He's little, but he's important. The pawn can only travel 1 square forward to the square e6, and on the next turn, e7. Now, the pawn does have some very special exceptions. All of the pawns for white will begin on rank number 2. I'm not going to add all of them there. I'm just going to add 4 of them to save time because we're trying to get all this game of chess learned in 15 minutes. So, if a pawn is on the starting row, which for white is the 2nd rank, it has the option of going 1 square forward or 2 squares forward. However, after you leave the home base, you can only go 1 square for the rest of the game. So this pawn on e2, it could go to e3 or e4. On the next turn, it has to go to e5, 1 square for the rest of the game. However, if white wanted to move the pawn on d2, that pawn would have the option of 1 or 2 because it's on home base. Pawns are also the only piece in chess that capture a different way than they move. Let's add some black pawns to make this game a little bit more interesting. And if white just moved the pawn from e2 to e4, it would be black's turn. Black might do the symmetrical move, pawn on e7 to e5. Now this white pawn is actually stuck. It's not because you did anything wrong. Pawns get stuck all the time. Pawns do not capture straightforward. They have to wait until there's another piece diagonally 1 square away. Of course, there's nothing on those squares and you can't capture a bunch of blank air. However, later in the game, let's just say white moves this pawn 1 square and black decides to move this pawn 2 squares. Well, that would be a mistake for black. Now, white pawn can capture by going 1 square diagonal and overtaking the square the black pawn is on. And if black is having a particularly bad day and pushes this pawn 1 square forward, white could, of course, capture again. Pawns move forward, but they capture diagonal. Couple more special moves about the pawn that we will learn a little bit later on. We've got one final piece, though, before we can put them all on the board and learn where they start. This last piece is the knight. Don't call it a horse. It hurts my ears when you say that. The knight moves 1, 2, stops, makes a turn, and moves 1 more. And if we were to fill in these squares with red boxes, you would see the shape of the capital L. So many people say the knight moves in the shape of an L. But the knight doesn't just have the ability to move to this square. It could also move 1, 2, turn, and make a backward L. That's another option. Okay, let's add a few more. We've already said F3 and D3. The knight could also move up 2 and over 1, up 2 and over 1 the other way. The knight could also move sideways and then up, sideways and then down, always moving 1, 2 turn. And you can probably figure out the completion of this pattern. Drum roll, please. I don't know if we got a drum roll, but knight can go to c4. Those are the 8 different squares the knight can move to. Now, one trick about the knight, unlike the bishop, the knight always changes colors. The knight's on a blue square, we call it a dark square. If it moves 1, 2 turn, it's on a light square. 1, 2 turn, a dark square, 1, 2 turn, a light square. And if you don't believe me, well, keep moving the knight and eventually you'll get it. The knight has a special power that no other piece has. The knight can jump over things. It only captures when it lands on something. If I put a black pawn on f6, the knight could jump over that pawn just like it's not even there. 1, 2, turn, and it completely ignores the pawn. Now, if the black pawn moves forward 1 square, the knight could move 1, 2, turn, and because it landed on the pawn, that's how the knight captures. The knight can jump over anything, its own pieces, the enemy pieces, kings, rooks, bishops, other knights, but it can only capture pieces that it lands on. Now that we know how all the pieces move, we've got to figure out what's the goal of this game. The goal of this game is actually to put the enemy king in danger so he can't get out of danger. Let's go ahead and learn a couple new words. If it's white's move here, white can move the rook sideways and stop on c5. And everybody watching the video can see the rook is aiming at the king. When the king's in danger, we call it check. Now the word checkmate sounds similar, but that's a special kind of check. We'll get to that in a minute. When the king is in danger, when you're in check, you have to get out of check on the very next turn. You don't have a choice. There are 3 ways to get out of check, and I like to use the term CPR. No, we're not saving anybody's life today. We're just saving the king's life. C stands for capture. If you capture the piece that's putting you in check, obviously your king will be safe. You've removed the danger. In this position, that's clearly the best move. The bishop can move diagonal, land on top of the rook, and when the rook's gone, the black king is not in check. In fact, you're probably figuring out right now, it's actually the white king that would be in check. Let's go back, though, and take a look at another option for black. Rook comes over to c5. The P in CPR stands for protect. That means to put a piece in the way or to block. In this position, the knight can come to the king's rescue by moving 1, 2, turn, and the king is safe because rooks don't jump over pieces, so the knight is the bodyguard. And the final way to get the king out of danger is to run away. That's the R in CPR. The king can run to the left or to the right or even diagonal. All of those would be safe from the white rook, but notice he could not move down the board. If he moves down, he would still be in danger. Now, strangely enough, if he does move down, you're not allowed to capture the king. You have to tell your opponent to take the move back and make a different move. Luckily on Chess Kid, the computer won't even let you make this move because it is considered illegal. Okay, so the king would move back and black has to find a different move. Now, what happens if you're in a chess position where you're in check, but you can't get out of danger? Well, that's when we have to learn a new word. Here, after a small reshuffling of pieces, let's have white move the queen diagonal all the way to the square c7. The king is clearly in danger. He has to use CPR. Now, C stands for capture. Notice here the king actually can't capture, because if he does, he'll be in danger with the rook, and it doesn't do you any good to get out of danger from one piece if you're still in danger from another piece. Pawns don't capture sideways. Knights don't go one square and then stop. I don't know who taught you that. And the bishop can't help because the bishop would need 2 moves to capture, and you have to get out of check on your next move. You also can't protect because that means to block, and there's simply no square in between the queen and the king. C7.5 doesn't exist. And the king can also not run away because if he tries to go left, right, or diagonal, the queen attacks all of those squares. This is actually the most common type of checkmate in chess. It's called queen and helper. The queen is doing the checking and the rook is the helper. This is checkmate. White wins. Notice white never actually captures the king. He just puts the king in danger, so the king can't use CPR to get safe. But wait just a second, we're not quite done. There's one more way a game of chess can end. It's not very common, and it usually means somebody made a mistake. Taking a look at our chessboard here, let's pretend it's black's move. Black's king is not in check because queens don't move like knights. They don't go 1, 2, and then turn. However, if the king tries to move to any of these squares, he would be in danger, and that's against the rules. You can't put your own king in danger. So what else does black do? If his king can't move, he's not in check though. He's got this pawn, but this pawn's stuck. Remember, pawns don't capture straightforward. So black has no legal move, but he's not in check. We call this stalemate. Surprisingly, the game ends in a tie, even though white has an extra queen. Much like life, when we use the word stalemate, it means nothing's happening. And here, black can't do anything. The game ends in a tie. So if you're the side with more pieces, you want to avoid a stalemate and go for a checkmate. You've now learned all the pieces. You've learned how a game of chess can end. There's 3 special rules you have to learn, and then you'll be a full-fledged chess player. One is called castling. That's a special move where you get to move 2 pieces at the same time. Usually the battle at the beginning of the game is in the center, so you don't want your king, which is kind of like your general, to be in the middle of the battle. So, castling is between a king and a rook. It's when nothing is in between your king and your rook. Your king travels 2 squares, which normally is not allowed, stops, and then the rook jumps over the king. Rooks clearly don't usually jump over things, but it's all one special move, and the goal of castling is to get your king behind a wall of pawns, which white has just done. Now black can also castle with his rook by moving the king 1, 2, and the rook jumps over. Kings always move 2 squares. I know the black king's a little further from the corner than the white king, but that's just the nature of castling on the other side of the chessboard. Now if we put the black king and rook back, we put the white king and rook back, there's a couple times in chess where you're not allowed to castle. If you've ever moved your king in a chess game, you can't castle for the rest of the game, even if you go back to the starting square. If you move your rook, you can't castle with that rook, but you could castle with the other rook if you still had it available. You also can't castle if it has anything to do with check. So if it's black's turn and black moves the bishop to b4 and puts the white king in check, you're not allowed to castle. If we magically sprinkle some fairy dust and make this bishop a light squared bishop, white also cannot castle here because his king is traveling through a square that's under attack. That's called castling through check. That's not allowed. Luckily on Chess Kid, the computer won't even let you do it. And lastly, you can't castle if your king lands in check, but that's always the case. You can never put your own king in check. So if we move this f-pawn forward and we sprinkle some more fairy dust and make this bishop back to a dark squared bishop, here white can't castle because if he moves his king 2 squares, he would already be in check by the bishop. So if you're thinking of castling and it has anything to do with check, you're not going to be allowed to. Let's learn a couple of special pawn moves. As you know, pawns are the only piece in chess that do not go backward. So if white's pawn on h2 moves 2 squares, and then later on moves again, and again, and again. We're not being very fair to black by not giving him any moves, but eventually the white pawn will get to the other side of the chessboard, and you can see what your 4 options are. Instead of just sitting there like a rock, who wants to play with a rock? We allow the pawn to turn into something bigger. We call this promotion. It doesn't matter if you are talking about a job or you're great in school. Promotions are always a good thing. And 99% of the time, you're going to want a queen. In fact, if you already have a queen, you're allowed to get a second queen, a third queen, a fourth queen. Some people don't know that, but I'm here to tell you that's the rule. So you always want a queen pretty much. We often call this queening a pawn because getting a queen is so common. And so that pawn turns into a queen. The queen is immediately checking the king. And if the king moves, by the way, you could actually keep going and capture the rook. That would be a great tactic, as we say in chess. One more special move to learn. In this position, the black pawn on g7 could go 2 squares to g5 and pass right by the white pawn. Now, this was actually a rule change in chess about 400 years ago. I don't know if you were around for it, I'm guessing not. Pawns used to be able to only move 1 square even on their first move, which means they would always give the enemy pawn 1 chance to capture. But because of this new rule that you know, pawns can move 2 squares on their first turn, we have a very special situation. If your pawn moves 2 squares and ends up directly beside an enemy pawn, and the enemy pawn could have captured if you had moved 1 square, then there's a special rule called en passant, which is French for in passing. The white pawn can go diagonal to a blank square and lift the black pawn off the board to make a capture. It looks incredibly strange. Most people that have not been trained don't even know this rule, but it is a rule of chess. It's only with pawns, and it's only on the very next turn. If you want to capture en passant, you have to do it right away. Let's go back and look at it one more time. Black's pawn moves 2 squares, and he's not directly in front of a white pawn. He's directly beside a white pawn. If I was the white player, I would ask myself, could I have captured this pawn if it had moved 1 square? Of course, the answer is yes. So capturing en passant is also yes. If it had moved 1 square, you could have captured. And because it moved 2 squares, you can still capture, and it's actually the exact same final position. Very strange rule, but it is a rule of chess. Now you know how all the pieces move. Check, checkmate, stalemate, castling, promotion, en passant. See, you're a chess player, you didn't even know it. However, in order to close out our video, maybe let's spend 30 seconds talking about where the pieces start and how to open a chess game. If you don't survive the opening, none of the other things are going to matter. This is where all the pieces begin. Notice the white queen starts on a white square, the black queen on a dark square. If you get that right, pretty much everything else falls into place. And these are my 3 main tips for starting a chess game. Number 1, you want to aim at the center of the chessboard. These are our 4 center squares. So the most common opening moves are e4 and d4, one of those 2 center pawns. And let's go ahead and keep on being unfair to black and give white more moves. If white could get both pawns in the center, that would be fantastic. Next rule of the opening is to get your knights and bishops off the back row. And where should they come? Toward the center. Notice those knights are aiming at center squares. Let's have white move the bishops out, aiming at the center. And then the final rule, besides controlling the center and getting your knights and bishops out, we call that developing, is to castle. Get your king safe. Usually that means castling. Here, the king can move 2. The rook can jump over, and the king is behind a wall of pawns. If you can think of those 3 things in your first 10 moves, you will have a great start to your chess game and to your chess career. Congratulations, you did it! You are now officially a chess player, and I look forward to you playing lots of games on Chess Kid very soon.